Hello, and welcome to my podcast, dennis.podcast.com. I'm here with Ashvan, and today we're going to talk about tough on crime amendments. How are you doing today, Ashvan?
I'm doing great, thanks.
All right, so let's start off with some context. What is being tough on crime, and why does it even exist? Well, tough on crime is the idea that by having stricter penalties on crimes, it will deter criminals from ever committing crime in the first place. Why? Well, during the 1980s to the early 2000s, crime rates in Canada were at record highs, and as a result, there was an outcry for a reduction in crime. As you might know, the government proposed a logical solution, and this was to be tough on crime. In 2012, Stephen Harper, along with his Conservative government, passed Bill C-10, which changed crime laws so that there are more mandatory minimum sentences, harsher sentences, and a basic removal of rehabilitation services such as the Lifeline program. So, Ashvan, why do you advocate for the repeal of these laws?
Well, as you grow older as a Canadian, you see more of how the system works. Unfortunately, it really doesn't work for the criminals. They go in and they really aren't better people and they leave, and sometimes they come back in. There's nothing really preventing that, and I just don't think it's a system that Canadians deserve.
So you see the Canadians who fail to be rehabilitated by the system. So in your opinion, do you think tough on crime legislation directly affects certain Canadians?
Well, I think it affects everyone, right? First, there are the criminals. They go to the system that I just don't agree with. Then there's the families, and also, really important to note, the taxpayer. They're paying a large amount for the system that just isn't efficient for how much to pay.
But what about the marginalized peoples in Canada? Like, for example, Indigenous communities or Black Canadians. Let me just rephrase my past question then. Do you think Indigenous communities and those in lower socioeconomic classes are affected by these laws?
Yeah, 100%. Like, unfortunately, they do come from more impoverished places, and we do see a correlation between that and incarceration rates. It is unfortunate to see them being taken away from the communities for such a long time. They're already impoverished as it is. It just makes it harder for their environment to prosper. And economically, it just isn't the best for them. To really show how large this issue is, I found a study from the OCI. They found that black men in America are 6 times more likely than a white person to be incarcerated. But in Canada, however, Indigenous people are 10 times more likely to be incarcerated than any other Canadian.
Although these laws affect marginalized groups, shouldn't criminals in general just be punished for their crimes?
Well, the point of our justice system isn't really to keep people incarcerated for the sake of incarceration. Sure, victims usually want a harsher sentence for the accused, but in Canadian law, the victim's subjective opinion on what is important is not as important as what's the right thing to do. This is an example of a violation of a part of Section 7 of the Charter or Liberty. If people have spent more time in jail just because we want to keep them out of society, that really isn't justifiable.
However, I think mandatory minimums and tough on crime legislation is justifiable under Section 1. Under Section 1, there's the Oakes test, and I just want to see what happens when we apply these kinds of laws to the Oakes test. Does a law have a rational connection to its objective? Of course it does. The objective of tough on crime legislation and mandatory minimums is to deter crime or potential criminals from ever committing crime in the first place. Does the law minimally impair the charter right? Of course it does. It impairs the charter rights of criminals for their security, of course, like you said, but as a result, it deters to-be criminals from ever committing crime in the first place, and obviously the average Canadian citizen, are not criminals. So not many people will be affected. Does the benefit of the law outweigh its effects? Of course it does. The benefit is we have a deterrence for to-be criminals who ever commit crime in the first place and an overall decrease in the crime rate. Its effects are minimally impairing our charter rights. Of course, it will impair criminals from Section 7 or Section 15, and maybe you could argue Section 12. But I think these laws will be justifiable under Section 1, and they won't hurt anybody other than the criminals themselves.
Sorry, do you mean reasonably impaired?
Oh, yes, my bad. I meant reasonably.
Well, here's the thing. I do think it's an unreasonable impairment of charter rights. Like, why would it take 10 plus years to change someone into a better person? That's an unreasonable amount of time.
But let's bring us back to the point of the objective of sentencing. Obviously, Under Section 718 of the Criminal Code of Canada, a judge must consider the objectives of sentencing for the betterment of society. These objectives also include denouncing unlawful conduct, deterring repeat offenders, and to protect society as a whole. As stated through tough on crime legislation and mandatory minimum sentences, wouldn't harsher sentences deter criminals from committing the same crimes?
Well, there you have to ask yourself, why would anyone be a better person once they come out of prison compared to once they came in? According to criminologist Irvin Waller, there really is no incentive for criminals to become better people, regardless of jail time. Also, there's some psychology to take in consideration here. When you get large numbers being juxtaposed together, they really devalue the significance of those numbers. For example, 10 years of one's life seems so long that 50 years will mentally feel the same. They're both simplified as just really big in your head. Psychology says that harsher sentences really don't help, and that's exactly what tough on crime is. Again, this is according to the Canadian Psychological Association. So, since this is true, harsh sentencing should be a violation of Section 7 of the Charter, specifically liberty, since life in prison doesn't have much of a different mental toll as 10 years. If they can be rehabilitated and re-entered into society faster, not doing so is an infringement.
I understand where you're coming from, but why do so many scholars cite tough on crime as a failure?
I'll say that is because firstly, it is cheaper to rehabilitate someone for a year compared to keeping them incarcerated. The source on this is the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. The war on drugs is another example. It didn't really get people to stop substance abuse, and the country spent hundreds of millions on incarceration and other legal expenses. Once people left jail, the descendants did it again as it didn't become better people. The Wells and Angelos case is an example of how the war on drugs went horribly wrong. He sold $350 worth of pot while in possession of a firearm, and as a result he received a minimum sentence of 55 years in prison since his sentence is stacked. The thing is, these minimum sentences assume that there is no wild variable in the case. Let's say that someone committed a crime with the mens rea, but they felt guilty about it, they admit to it, and made attempts to make things better. This still will be forced to be sentenced to the minimum amount. Again, all of these examples just prove that there are clear violations of human rights. The liberty that was taken away only led to terrible results.
Oh, it looks like we got a message from Declan here. He asks, what do you think will happen if tough on crime legislation still exists in the future? And do you think it will come with a cost?
Nice spelling, bro.
Well, personally, I don't think it will come with any cost, because in the future we will see tough on crime legislation decrease crime and protect us from potential criminals. Without tough on crime legislation, we would be infringing on the very section Mr. Ashford has been advocating for this entire segment, which is Section 7. Section 7 includes the right to liberty, as well as the security of a person, and by removing tough on crime laws and legislation, we would be compromising our security. This is because we would have undeterred criminals next to citizens, regular Canadian citizens, which would be a huge security risk. So Ashfan, what's your opinion on this question?
Well, I think if tough on crime laws were to stay the same, crime rates will probably stay the same. I really don't think the two are correlated at all, but I do think that it would be more costly over time as the system really isn't efficient for how much money we're putting into it. I think if we were to get rid of the laws as it is, Canada will see a record low crime rate and criminals will likely not commit crimes again. I think the real reason why crime was going down since the 80s is because over time, standard of living, an aging population, and technology got better. Sure, some US states successfully lowered crime after implementing tough on crime rules, but at the same time other states saw the opposite. Tough on crime was not the root solution. To treat tough on crime as it was a solution is not only unethical, but it spreads wild misconceptions. It wasn't based on facts, and as a result, it is unjustifiable under Section 1, because laws cannot be based on false information.
So let me summarize my stance on this issue. I believe tough on crime legislation and also mandatory minimums should stay, and I think they are very valuable in Canadian society, and I think they prevent criminals from ever, committing crimes in the first place. And I think most of Canada agrees with my sentiment. I mean, a national poll showed that 58% of respondents said that mandatory minimum sentences were a good idea.
Well, you have to make sure you look at the numbers right. So, although you're right in one sense that a lot of people do support this, 74% support the idea that there should be judicial discretion in imposing mandatory minimums.
Oh, that's well, like, of course we would want to trust our judiciary system to enforce these kinds of laws, but like having mandatory minimums and having tough on crime laws will also create fairness and consistencies throughout our system, so they don't, mess up, I guess, when it comes to convicting these criminals.
Well, I wouldn't say for sure that it creates more consistency. For example, in Canada, we really prioritize precedents, so that already creates consistency in itself. I think having a minimum is actually kind of damaging for the judges because they can't really choose to go under.
I mean, what about the criminals when they hear that you're lowering down minimums? Wouldn't they be incentivized to commit more crimes because there's no punishment, or there's no mandatory punishment that they will be facing, right? They will now have the hope that the judge will mess up or have this kind of discretion, therefore incentivizing crime.
Sure, but at the same time, hopefully we expect criminals not to know every piece of detail about sentences, right? We have many examples where this wasn't the case, so just to say that it would deter criminals isn't always true. Like I said before, sometimes it doesn't matter the actual number of years they're being put behind bars, it's more of the impact they feel.
It looks like we're running short on time, so what solutions are you proposing for tough on crime legislation, if we need them at all?
Well, firstly, I think we should open more rehab resources. Unfortunately, they were cut, taken down, or just defunded from the Harper government, and we really need them right now. Also, lower years spent in jail for each crime. I really don't think 20 plus years, 10 plus years is necessary for anything. Removing minimum sentences will go a long way. It makes sentencing even more flexible for judges overall. I think they're the people that know the best when it comes to sentences and how much a person deserves to be behind bars. Also, just better investment in education and jobs. That will be enough to raise the quality of life to the point where being a criminal just isn't worth it.
I see. So you're saying that the underlying cause of crime is not from crimes itself, but from social, economical kind of factors?
Yeah, isn't that like always the case in Canada, where the problems don't always seem as direct as they are? Sometimes the indirect things that aren't always in the first thing that people think of.
Well, my solutions that I'm proposing is basically no solution at all, because all we have to do is to do nothing. I think the laws right now that we have are perfect, and they helped decrease the crime. I mean, in 2016 or 2015, we've been at record lows of crime rates, and under Trudeau's government, that has been rising. Maybe it could possibly be because that he said he would repeal these kinds of mandatory minimums.
Yeah, again, it sounds a lot like correlation, not causation. It's very hard to say that was the pinnacle of where crime dropped and when crime rose. There's many other factors. Again, there's technology, there's just an aging population, and as far as I can see...
I think you're wrong. I completely disagree with your opinion, and all this facts and stuff is all just your opinion. Subjective.
Okay, maybe we can't find common ground now, but at least we had a nice discussion. Would you agree?
No, that was like terrible. You didn't even let me talk, okay? I was just only asking questions here. Just get off my show. Just get out. Get out. Okay, guys, thanks for listening. It's been nice having you guys listen to me and talk about... Yeah, well, I didn't really say anything, but is it 14 minutes yet? Yeah. Oh. Just leave. Jeez. Okay, thank you for listening.